Look, some people think marriage means you stop growing, stop wanting more, stop being honest about what you need. I'm Olivia, 34, and I've never been that type of woman. When Cameron and I got together 8 years ago, he said he loved my honesty, my willingness to push boundaries. Funny how that changes when the boundaries actually matter. We just moved back to my hometown after Cameron got transferred for work. I was excited to reconnect with old friends, especially Dante, who I'd known since high school. Dante and I had this connection that just clicked. We never dated back then, but there was always this understanding between us. He got my jokes, remembered details about my life that even Cameron would forget, like how I take my coffee or the fact that I hate surprise parties, little things that show someone actually pays attention. Cameron's always been the practical one. Steady income, wants the white picket fence, thinks happiness comes from following some predetermined script. But after 8 years together, I was starting to feel like we were just going through the motions. Our conversations had become surface-level small talk about bills and weekend plans. When was the last time he'd really looked at me, really seen me? When was the last time we'd talked about anything that mattered? I remember our early days when Cameron would ask about my dreams, my fears, what kept me up at night. Now he'd come home from work, grunt hello, and zone out in front of the TV. If I tried to start a real conversation, he'd give me these one-word answers, like talking to his wife was some huge burden. Meanwhile, I was supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he threw my way. Meanwhile, every group hangout with Dante reminded me what real connection felt like. The way he'd lean in when I talked, actually ask follow-up questions, laugh at my stories like they mattered. I wasn't doing anything inappropriate. We were always in groups, always with other people around. But I'd catch myself looking forward to those nights more than I looked forward to coming home to Cameron. The difference was night and day. With Dante, I felt like myself again. The woman Cameron had fallen in love with before he decided I was just another household responsibility to manage. Dante would text me funny memes during the day, remember conversations we'd had weeks earlier, ask my opinion on things that actually mattered. When was the last time Cameron had done any of that? I started noticing how Cameron would get this tight expression whenever I mentioned Dante's name. Not exactly jealous, but suspicious. Like he was keeping score of how often I brought him up in conversation. God forbid I have a friend who actually paid attention to me. Cameron used to be curious about my day, my thoughts, my dreams. Now he'd ask, "How was your day?" while scrolling through his phone, barely listening to my answer. The contrast became impossible to ignore. With Dante, I felt alive, appreciated, seen. With Cameron, I felt like furniture he'd gotten used to having around. I'd try to tell him about something that happened at work, and he'd nod along while clearly thinking about something else entirely. But mention that Dante and I had grabbed coffee after a group hangout, and suddenly, Cameron was all ears, asking pointed questions about timing and who else was there. When I started changing my phone settings, it wasn't because I was hiding anything. It was because Cameron had started doing this thing where he'd glance at my screen whenever I got a text. Not asking directly who it was from, just watching, like he was building some case against me in his head. A grown woman shouldn't have to explain every conversation like she's a teenager with a curfew. The irony was that Cameron demanded complete transparency from me while becoming increasingly closed off himself. He'd come home from work drained, give me one-word answers about his day, then act hurt when I found more engaging conversation elsewhere. I was supposed to be satisfied with scraps of his attention while he got to monitor every aspect of my social life like some jealous teenager. Between us, I was getting tired of apologizing for having connections that actually fulfilled me. Dante never made me feel like I had to shrink myself or tone down my personality. With him, I could be funny, spontaneous, real. With Cameron, I felt like I was walking on eggshells, constantly worried about saying the wrong thing or seeming too enthusiastic about anything that didn't involve him directly. The more Cameron pulled away, the more I realized what I'd been missing. Real conversation. Genuine laughter. Someone who actually cared about my thoughts and feelings instead of just tolerating my presence. And honestly, It made me question whether Cameron and I were even compatible anymore, or if we'd just been coasting on routine and familiarity for years. I tried talking to Cameron about how disconnected we'd become, but he'd just shrug and say, relationships took work, like that explained everything. No effort to actually address the problems, just this resigned acceptance that marriage meant settling for less than what you actually wanted. Meanwhile, I could see exactly what we were missing every time I spent time with Dante, and remembered what real chemistry felt like. After months of feeling like Cameron and I were living parallel lives instead of sharing one, I started having these thoughts about what it would take to fix us. We needed something to shake us out of this rut, something to remind us both what passion looked like. And the more I thought about it, the more obvious the solution became. What if instead of being threatened by my connection with Dante, Cameron could be part of it? What if we could add that energy, that chemistry, to our marriage instead of pretending it didn't exist? I know how that might sound to some people, but I was trying to be creative, trying to save what Cameron and I had built together, instead of just watching it slowly die. I'd read articles about couples who'd successfully opened their relationships, who'd found ways to explore new dynamics without destroying their foundation. These weren't broken people or sex addicts. They were couples who recognized that one person couldn't fulfill every need, who were mature enough to acknowledge attraction to others and work with it instead of pretending it didn't exist. Cameron was always talking about wanting to make me happy, wanting to be a better husband. Here was his chance to prove it, instead of just offering empty words. Instead of being insecure about my connection with Dante, he could embrace it, learn from it, maybe even discover things about me he'd forgotten or never known in the first place. I started dropping hints about alternative relationship structures, mentioning articles I'd read about couples who'd found creative solutions to relationship ruts. Cameron would just change the subject or give me these blank stares like I was speaking a foreign language. His complete inability to even engage with the concept just proved how rigid he'd become about everything. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Cameron and I had fallen into this pattern where we were more like business partners than lovers. We split bills, managed household tasks, made small talk about our days, but where was the passion? Where was the desire? When was the last time he'd looked at me like he actually wanted me, instead of just going through the motions? Dante had always been able to draw out sides of me that Cameron seemed to have forgotten existed. My sense of humor, my spontaneity, my intelligence, all the things that had attracted Cameron to me in the first place before he decided I was just another responsibility to manage. With Dante, I felt beautiful, interesting, worth pursuing. With Cameron, I felt taken for granted. I wasn't trying to replace Cameron, I was trying to enhance what we had. Show him what he'd been missing. Remind him why he'd fallen in love with me in the first place. But apparently, even discussing the possibility was too threatening for his fragile ego. He'd rather pretend our problems didn't exist than actually work on solutions. Honestly, I was offering him something most husbands never get: complete honesty about what I needed, a chance to be part of the solution instead of just ignoring the problem. Most wives would just cheat or leave or suffer in silence. I was trying to include him, to make him part of fixing us instead of just giving up on 8 years together. But Cameron couldn't see past his own insecurity to understand what I was actually trying to give him. The fact that he wouldn't even consider it told me everything I needed to know about how willing he was to fight for our marriage. Apparently, his love came with conditions. I could be happy as long as it didn't challenge his comfort zone or require any real effort on his part. I spent weeks building up the courage to have the conversation I knew we needed to have. Every night, I'd plan what I'd say, how I'd explain it so he'd understand I wasn't trying to hurt him. I was trying to save us. I was trying to find a way to bring back the passion and connection we'd lost, instead of just accepting that marriage meant settling for less. I planned the conversation carefully. Cameron came home from work last Tuesday, actually seeming relaxed for once, and we'd managed to have dinner without any of the weird tension that had been building between us for months. We'd even laughed together at something stupid on TV, and for a moment, it felt like old times. I thought maybe this was my opportunity to finally address what we both knew we'd been avoiding. "I want to talk to you about something important," I said, settling next to him on the couch after dinner. "And I need you to really hear me out before you react." I could see his shoulders tense immediately, which honestly just proved my point about how defensive he'd become about any conversation deeper than discussing whose turn it was to take out the trash. "What if we tried something new?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle and non-confrontational. "What if we brought someone else into our relationship, someone who could help us reconnect?" The way his expression shifted from confusion to something harder, it was like watching him shut down in real time. Like he'd already decided this was some kind of attack, instead of an attempt to fix what was broken between us. When he asked if I had someone specific in mind, I told him the truth. Dante and I had this natural chemistry that Cameron and I had lost somewhere along the way. Maybe Cameron could learn something from seeing how Dante interacted with me, how he made me feel seen and appreciated and desired. I wasn't suggesting we throw away 8 years. I was suggesting we build on them, add something that could remind us both why we'd fallen in love in the first place. But Cameron immediately went into interrogation mode. "Do you want to be with him instead of me? How long have you been thinking about this? Are you already cheating?" Like I was some unfaithful wife, instead of someone trying to have an honest conversation about our marriage. Every question felt like an accusation, like he'd already decided I was the enemy instead of his partner trying to solve a problem we both knew existed. The worst part was how he made it sound like I was asking for something crazy and unreasonable. Like wanting passion in my marriage was some outrageous demand. Like expecting my husband to fight for us instead of just accepting mediocrity was asking too much. I'd spent months thinking about this, trying to find a solution that would work for both of us. And his immediate response was to make me feel like some kind of pervert for even suggesting it. When I stopped answering his rapid-fire questions, when I tried to explain that this wasn't about choosing Dante over him, but about choosing both of them, about choosing us, he just walked out. No discussion, no attempt to understand my perspective. Just grabbed his keys and left me sitting there like my feelings didn't matter at all. Like 8 years of marriage meant I didn't even deserve the courtesy of a real conversation. I spent the next few hours calling and texting, trying to explain myself properly, trying to get him to come home so we could talk like adults. But Cameron's solution to difficult conversations has always been avoidance. God forbid we actually work through our problems instead of just pretending they don't exist. God forbid he have to examine whether maybe, just maybe, our marriage had problems that needed addressing. Cameron came back the next morning while I was getting ready for work. But he might as well have stayed wherever he'd been hiding all night. He moved around the house like I wasn't even there. Wouldn't make eye contact. Wouldn't respond when I tried to restart our conversation from the night before. Like I was some stranger who'd wandered into his house instead of his wife trying to save their marriage. "We need to talk about this," I said, following him into the bedroom, where he was pulling clothes out of drawers with sharp, angry movements. "You can't just shut down every time we have a difficult conversation." But he kept packing like I wasn't speaking. Like 8 years of marriage meant nothing if things got complicated. "I can't do this anymore," he finally said, not even looking at me. Not, "Let's work on this," or "Let's try counseling," or any of the things you'd expect from someone who actually wanted to save their marriage. Just immediate surrender, because Cameron's never been one to fight for anything that required real effort or emotional risk. I tried to explain that this was exactly why we needed to try something new, that his inability to even discuss our problems was proof that we'd grown apart. But Cameron had already made up his mind. He'd rather throw away everything we'd built than even consider that maybe, just maybe, I knew what I was talking about when it came to what our relationship needed. "You've already chosen," he said when I begged him not to leave. Like I'd chosen Dante over him, when really I'd been trying to choose both. Choose us. Choose growth instead of stagnation. But Cameron's always seen the world in black and white. No creativity, no willingness to think beyond whatever narrow box society told him was acceptable. The really devastating part? He blocked me. Completely. Phone, social media, email, everything. Like I was some stalker ex instead of his wife trying to save their marriage. 8 years together and he couldn't even give me the basic respect of staying in communication while we figured things out. Just complete radio silence, like I'd never mattered to him at all. Within a week, I found out through a mutual friend that Cameron had already moved in with his buddy Trevor. Not even trying to work things out, not even suggesting we take a break to think. Just done. Like our entire relationship had been disposable to him the moment I asked for something more than the mediocre routine we'd settled into. The speed of it all was what really got to me. 8 years together, and he could just walk away like it meant nothing. No attempt at counseling, no effort to understand my perspective, no willingness to fight for what we'd built. Just immediate abandonment, the second I dared to suggest we address the problems we both knew existed. 3 months later, I discovered Cameron had filed for divorce. Didn't even have the decency to tell me himself. I had to find out when the papers showed up at my door, like some kind of eviction notice. Apparently, he'd been consulting with a lawyer since the week he left, which just proves he never intended to fight for us anyway. All those years of him claiming he'd do anything to make me happy, and the moment I actually told him what would make me happy, he ran straight to a lawyer. The paperwork was brutal. Cold, clinical language reducing 8 years of shared life to a list of assets to be divided. No mention of the dreams we'd shared, the plans we'd made, the love I'd thought we had. Just business. Like our marriage had been nothing more than a financial arrangement that had run its course. The twisted part is how everyone's treating me like I'm the one who destroyed our marriage. Our mutual friends, my family, even people at work who somehow heard about what happened, they all act like suggesting we explore new relationship dynamics makes me some kind of homewrecker. Nobody wants to acknowledge that Cameron abandoned our marriage the second things required actual effort. My sister actually had the nerve to tell me I should have just accepted that marriages get boring, that expecting passion after 8 years was unrealistic, like settling for a dead bedroom and superficial conversations was just part of being a grown-up. Like wanting more from my marriage made me immature and selfish instead of honest about what I needed to be happy. And Dante? Well, once word spread about what had happened, he started keeping his distance too. All those deep conversations, all that connection I thought we had, apparently it only mattered when it was risk-free. So much for being the kind of man who wasn't afraid of real intimacy. Turns out he was just as shallow as Cameron when push came to shove. The worst part was how Dante acted like I'd somehow misread our connection. Like all those meaningful conversations and shared moments had been in my head. Like I'd imagined the chemistry between us, instead of responding to something real. Just another man who was happy to flirt and connect as long as there were no real consequences, no actual commitment required. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks ago. Cameron got to play the victim in our friend group, while I got labeled as the wife who threw away a good marriage for another man. The truth, that I was trying to save us, that I was willing to be creative and honest about fixing our problems, doesn't fit the narrative everyone prefers. Now I'm 34, starting over in a town where everyone thinks they know my story. I heard through the grapevine that Cameron's already seeing someone, some quiet administrative assistant who probably never challenges him or asks for anything beyond basic companionship. Perfect for a man who runs the moment real intimacy gets complicated. The speed of his recovery was what really stung. 8 years together, and he'd already moved on like I'd never existed. Like everything we'd shared had meant so little that he could just replace me with the first woman who didn't ask him to grow or change or examine whether he was actually putting effort into the relationship. But here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. I'm not sorry I asked for what I wanted. I'm not sorry I refused to pretend everything was fine when we both knew our marriage had become a hollow shell of what it used to be. Maybe I'm alone now, but at least I was honest about what I needed instead of just accepting whatever scraps of attention Cameron was willing to give me. The real tragedy isn't that our marriage ended. It's that Cameron was so threatened by the possibility of growth that he chose divorce over even trying to understand what I was offering him. 8 years together, and he couldn't trust me enough to believe I wanted him to be part of the solution instead of just replacing him with someone else. The loneliness hits sometimes, especially when I see other couples who seem to have what Cameron and I could have had if he'd been willing to try. But I'd rather be alone and honest about what I want than trapped in a marriage that was slowly suffocating both of us. At least now I know exactly what kind of man I'm looking for. Someone who sees challenges as opportunities instead of threats. Someone who fights for what matters instead of running away the moment things get real. Looking back, maybe the signs were always there that Cameron wasn't the kind of man who could handle a woman who knew her worth. All those times he'd shut down when I tried to talk about deeper issues. All those moments when he'd choose comfort over growth. I just kept hoping he'd surprise me, that he'd prove he was capable of more than just going through the motions. The hardest part isn't losing Cameron. It's realizing that the man I thought I married was never really there at all. He was just playing a part, saying what he thought I wanted to hear until the moment I asked him to actually live up to those words. 8 years of my life invested in someone who turned out to be exactly as basic and predictable as every other man who thinks marriage means the woman should just be grateful for whatever she gets and never ask for more.